The vampire Dracula is one of the most recognisable figures in popular culture, and maybe one of the few truly important characters in the development of modern horror. First appearing in Bram Stoker's 1897 novel of the same name, Dracula has gone on to feature in over 200 films, on top of TV adaptations, stage shows, ballet, anime, graphic novels, and much more besides. Horror is a reflection of the cultural fears of a given historical moment, and thus all of these adaptations reflect the fears and anxieties of the time in which the film or adaptation was produced. Given that we tend to get a major Dracula adaptation about once a decade, you can track the ways in which horror has developed and how the fears of a society have changed through the Dracula adaptations made. We get the Dracula we deserve. The 1920s had the copyright-infringing NOSFERATU, the 1930s had the landmark adaptation starring Bela Lugosi, the 50s and 60s had the Hammer horror films and Christopher Lee. The early 2000s we had, for better or worse, Twilight. And in 2020, we got Stephen Moffat and Mark Gatiss' version of Dracula, which, given how the rest of 2020 has gone, seems about right. But we shouldn't just rely on one contrarian take on this. Let's see what the critics thought. Oh, I see. It is, how to put this? Not very good. It would be straightforward enough to talk about the ways in which it's not good, but the internet can encourage a cynicism towards culture and critical responses to it. And look, I'm not here to spoil anyone's fun. If you liked it, cool. And there's stuff about the show that I thought was good. I'm not mad. I'm just so disappointed. What's maybe more interesting is to talk about the reasons why this version doesn't really work, the issues of adapting something like Dracula in the first place, and what, if anything, we can say about the cultural work the vampire still does in a modern capitalist society. However, before we can talk about what we ended with, we need to talk about how we got here, and to do that, we need to talk about where things started. Let's talk about Dracula, the novel. The novel Dracula was first published in 1897 by Bram Stoker. It did relatively well, attracted a few glowing reviews at the time, and was pretty successful. An important thing to point out is that the novel really wasn't that new or innovative. It did well partly because it was familiar and tapped into some wider trends in a particular kind of literature. There was a real audience for invasion literature, for adventure stories. Think of H. Rider Haggard, Arthur Conan Doyle, H.G. Wells, George Chesney, or Jules Verne. And in that sense, Stoker's Dracula was the right book, in the right place, at the right time. That isn't to say it isn't good, it absolutely is, but it's just admitting that Stoker knew what the book was, and we shouldn't make the mistake of pretending that this book is something that it isn't. He wrote the book alongside his day job as business manager of the Lyceum Theatre, and working as an assistant to the legendary Victorian ham, Sir Henry Irving. So we have a well-made and researched adventure story written by a talented hack with a keen understanding of both the literary scene of the time and theatrical technique. On top of that, when it comes to vampire fiction, this wasn't that new either. J.W. von Goethe's poem The Bride of Corinth has a proto-vampiric bride character. John Polidori's The Vampire established the Byronic and aristocratic nature of the vampire back in 1819. Then there was James Malcolm Rymer's serialized penny dreadful, Varney the Vampire, which was a mammoth piece of vampire lore which runs to over 500,000 words in total, making it something which would fit really well in the quick read category of AO3. Then there's Sheridan Le Fanu's amazing queer vampire story Carmilla from 1871, which was almost certainly a big influence on Stoker's own work. So, if Dracula doesn't necessarily do anything all that new, then what makes the novel so good? It didn't just hit a pulp fiction sweet spot, but managed to refine and establish many of the pre-existing vampire tropes and expectations of the audience into something surprising and effective. A lot of this is tied up in the structure of the text. Like a lot of Gothic novels, it's a found or pieced together manuscript. It's made up of diaries, letters, telegrams, phonograph recordings, and travelogues. It's pieced together from a myriad of different points of view, and the style means that we get to see the personalities of all the main players and the ways in which their own actions interact on the plot. On top of that, the narrative being produced from the point of view of a group of protagonists keeps Dracula mostly in the background. He becomes a more mysterious and dangerous figure, and so the character's epistolary writing doesn't just unfold plot and characterizing action, but allows the reader to find out about the vampire through the actions and interactions of the characters. It's easy to read, engaging, and still properly scary, even after being almost endlessly adapted and parodied. If you've never sat down and read it, it's a really enjoyable story. It's full of short chapters told from a variety of different points of view, and in the telling, it reveals a whole lot about Victorian society. It was a period of massive instability and rupture, so even in this pulpy gothic horror melodrama adventure story, you get to see all of these fascinating tensions and fractures around issues like gender, sexuality, science, reason, and superstition, even the nature of evil. So, all of this raises the question of how exactly do you turn this text into another form? The very first adaptation of Dracula actually goes some way to explaining a lot about subsequent versions. So, according to the Stage Licensing Act of 1737 and the Theatres Act of 1843, it was necessary for all plays to be submitted to the Office of the Lord Chamberlain for approval and copyright licensing. By the way, if you're thinking this is a recipe for state censorship of the theatre, you would be absolutely correct, and you should know that the law was in effect until 1968. Long story short, in order to keep a hold of his copyright on the text, Stoker staged the very first adaptation of the novel, which, in a quirk of scheduling, was actually performed 8 days before the novel itself was actually published. Stoker's theatrical version was a sort of script-in-hand style read-through, with a hastily rushed-together script. Posters went up around the theatre 30 minutes before the show started, and the audience, aside from the actors in the theatre, was made up of 2 paying customers, which means that the show was twice as successful as most shows at the Edinburgh Fringe. Stoker was apparently disappointed that the head of the company, and the person widely regarded as being the inspiration for Dracula, Henry Irving, took no part in the production. Legend has it that when Stoker asked Irving what he thought of the performance, Irving replied with just one word: dreadful. Stoker's adaptation is both incredibly rushed and kind of terrible. One of the great things about the novel is that Stoker is really good at narration and atmosphere. The opening section of Harker's diary records his long journey in great detail, so by the time he's arrived at the castle, the reader is primed for all of the subsequent spookiness. Like Harker, the reader has to go on the journey, so that by the time you arrive, the strange, eerie, and creepy events don't strain disbelief to breaking point. The first stage version starts with Harker at the door of Dracula's castle, and just has Harker tell the audience in a very long, very boring monologue what the journey has been like so far. In terms of form, this does make some sense. Theatre has a tradition of addressing the audience, but there's a conflict here between the exposition to the audience and the necessary atmosphere and tension building which the opening of the novel depends on. In a way, theatre isn't really the best vehicle for the novel. It was just waiting for another medium. The first cinematic adaptation is a now allegedly lost silent film called Dracula's Death, produced in Hungary in 1921. Then comes F.W. Murnau's famous 1922 version, NOSFERATU. The production company behind the film couldn't get permission to use the novel, so Henrik Galeen, the actor and screenwriter, was just told to make plenty of changes to avoid potential legal issues. This mostly included renaming some characters, Dracula becomes Orlok, and cutting quite a few characters entirely. However, as they didn't include a fair use disclaimer in the video description, Florence Stoker, Bram's widow, sued them and won, and the judge ordered all copies of the film destroyed. All of this illegal wrangling made the novel hugely popular, which would only increase over the next decade. So, these 2 adaptations show 2 ways of transforming the original material. First, you can try and include as much as possible, but change what needs to be changed for the practicalities of the medium, or you can try and change the text, but allow it to remain close enough to the structures of the novel so that it remains still identifiably Dracula. All of this is cumulative too. The first theatrical versions feed into Nosferatu, which led to the new theatrical version, which opened in the USA in 1927, with a lead actor who would go on to be arguably the most famous on-screen Dracula, Bela Lugosi. The 1931 Universal Studios film with Bela Lugosi as the Count, directed by Todd Browning, is one of the defining films of the Universal golden age of monster films, and in a way, from this point on-screen adaptations of Dracula were less about dealing with the novel and more about responding to previous adaptations. This is especially true of adaptations of Dracula from around the past 30 years or so. Then, between the 30s and the 70s, came two distinct adaptational styles: Universal's films from 1931 to 48, and a film version of the old stage adaptation done in the 1970s, and the Hammer horror productions from 1958 to 1974, with many of them starring the iconic Christopher Lee. There's just not the time to cover all the various ways in which these two traditions dealt with the text, as they include comedies, modernized versions, and traditional retellings, but both had their own consistent tones and styles. The slightly more traditional Universal flicks, with their castles, capes, and crucifixes, and the more camp, even garish and violent Hammer horror films. This leads to two things. One, good adaptations depend upon a consistency of tone, and secondly, any adaptation is by necessity a revision of the original text. There's literally no other way of getting this novel on screen. So, a bad reason to dislike this show is that it isn't like the book. After all, the very nature of the epistolary novel means that you have to make changes somewhere. But it's important to point out that there has to be some clear relationship between the adaptation and the source material for the adaptation to remain somewhat coherent. And before we get into the nitty-gritty, before all of this gets way too negative, let's talk about the things which are actually pretty good. Obviously, spoilers in full effect from here on out. The opening of episode 1, that's cool. We open in media res with Harker, who looks seriously ill, being interviewed by two nuns about his experiences in Castle Dracula. This is fun and an immediate, interesting way into the story. The opening makes the novel's subtextual anxiety around non-normative sexuality much more explicit, and that's cool and a good way of modernizing the text. It seems like a natural way of transforming the epistolary form to a visual medium, preserving the atmosphere of the novel whilst avoiding the expository monologues of the first stage versions. Episode 2. Episode 2 has a great premise and opens really strongly as a kind of nautical Murder on the Orient Express. Episode 3 has a great opening where Dracula appears on the Whitby coast in the modern age, and I'm starting to see a pattern here. Dolly Wells. Dolly Wells is great, should absolutely be in more stuff. And honestly, that's about it. This is how we got here. Let's see what we got. When it comes to adapting 19th century pop culture, Moffat is starting to fall into a pattern. Obviously, everyone knows about Sherlock, and the less said about that, the better, if only because H-Bomb's video on it is both extremely long and very thorough, link down below. He's also behind an adaptation of/sequel to the brilliant gothic novel The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, called Jekyll, which aired on British TV in 2007. All of this raises the genuinely terrifying possibility that Moffat is one day soon going to produce a modern adaptation of The Picture of Dorian Gray, and it'll be the crowning achievement of his ability to ruin everything good about some of the best literature written in the 1800s. The biggest problem is that the novel Dracula and a whole load of subsequent adaptations create a compelling central group of characters who, through collective action, manage to overcome a threatening antagonist. For all of its flaws, the novel offers a coherent and complete narrative arc with an ending which is both satisfying and feels earned. Problem is that by now we know that a Stephen Moffat written series isn't going to give us that, but is going to suggest, imply, highlight the possibility of maybe, sometime, possibly, off in the future, some kind of coherent story might come together. Thus, what this adaptation is for, and one of the most substantial issues with it, is to try and outsmart its source material, rather than use that source material to generate its own complete story. So what we get is a collection of disparate ideas which never actually coalesce into a coherent narrative, a whole host of references and nods to other adaptations, and the by now expected Moffat-isms of twists, poorly developed female characters, and self-satisfied dialogue. All of this brings us to maybe the biggest issue. These 3 episodes have a major tone problem. Tone is tricky. It's fragile, hard to create, and very easy to dispel. Horror lives and dies by its tone. You can create 2 films with broadly similar plots, but they'll come out as wildly different films. Think about 2 versions of Dracula from 1979. First, you have Werner Herzog's Nosferatu the Vampire, and then John Madden's Dracula. Both make revisions to the text, but broadly both have plots which are relatively similar. One is lush, romantic, with Frank Langella as a seductive and dangerous libertine vampire. In contrast, Klaus Kinski is a vampire of pathos, both terrifying and almost, but never ultimately, sympathetic. All of this is created and sustained through a huge number of factors like the script, lighting, art direction, costuming, cinematography, and if any of those factors had not worked together, the whole film would not have been so convincing. The 1922 version of Nosferatu manages to nail this, thanks to its links to German Expressionism and the trends and motifs of that artistic movement that go beyond a strict sense of mimetic realism. So, what is Dracula 2020 on a tonal level? It's a mess. A good example comes in the first episode, set in a remote convent. Dracula appears at the gate, and the nuns gather to try and fend off an attack. It's a tense and exciting moment, a standoff between 2 clearly defined antagonists with high stakes and a genuine sense of threat. There's a wolf out there at the gates, and then instead of transforming back into Dracula, the Count literally tears his way out of the wolf and stands there dripping in blood and gore and stares down the terrified nuns. It's actually really good and a great moment of body horror, and then in the very next instant, we get a dick joke. Because he's naked and they are nuns. Great job. Great job, Stephen. Any tension is dispelled as the whole scene grinds to a halt, so we can do the first of so many moments between 2 characters, with one explaining the other's powers to their face. In a way, it's eerily reminiscent of that first theatrical adaptation, where Stoker just had his characters do exposition dumps in opening monologues, rather than maintain the novel's atmosphere or allow action to both reveal character and drive forward the narrative. The opening episode also decides to self-consciously reference previous adaptations, and whilst you can do that successfully, it has to be integrated into a consistent form and structure. The 1992 Dracula film is full of references to earlier texts, but reflects this historicity in its use of traditional in-camera special effects, period setting and costuming, and much more besides. Dracula 2020 is a revisionist retelling of a classic story, which is also trying, at least in the very beginning, to be a reasonably faithful adaptation, whilst referencing the 22 and 31 versions. It wants to be a slick, contemporary horror thriller, which talks about biotechnology and medical experimentation, and at the same time, it also wants to be a camp, quippy, Hammer horror-style schlockfest with vampire babies and what I think are supposed to be zombies in that first episode? Slight tangent, but I feel like I could talk for about an hour about the vampire baby scene. It's based on a short moment in the novel, which Harker records in his diary. It's bleak and sickly depressing as Harker realizes just how utterly fucked he truly is. In this version, it's a moment that is both genuinely really funny and something which is only included because this adaptation tries to outsmart its source material and makes one of the most crucial plot points of the early part of the novel way more complicated. So, in the novel, Harker spots Dracula crawling down the side of the castle walls like a giant predatory lizard. It's this weird and unsettling thing, and then after realizing that he might die in the castle, Harker decides to try to do the same thing in order to get out. In the 2020 adaptation, this would be all too simple, and a chance to add some depth to a character who, even in the original novel, is a little bit dull. Instead, we have this absolutely pointless subplot about the castle architect and his dead wife, and a map, and it's a complete waste of time, but it is yet more evidence that Moffat likes to construct narrative mazes with nothing at their centre. The whole 3 episodes are riddled with this kind of tonal dissonance, and whilst there are highlights, that grand Guignol-style slaughter at the monastery is really cool, but that lasts for around 10 minutes in a feature-length episode of TV. It's an adaptation that doesn't know what kind of vampire story it wants to tell, and so it tries to tell all of them. This brings up another problem. The pacing of this show is absolutely awful. There are moments of fast action, tension, drama, which are regularly brought to a screaming halt. The biggest issue in this respect is the relationship between Van Helsing and Dracula, who spend whole stretches of each of the 3 episodes just standing around and talking to one another. Mostly with Van Helsing explaining to Dracula what we've seen Dracula do, and Dracula just mostly making puns in response. And these scenes go on for so long. There is a scene in the final episode which is supposed to be a climactic confrontation between 3 incredibly important characters, and it is 10 minutes of this kind of talking. No one really does anything. One of the crutches of horror as a form is padding, spinning out a weak plot till you hit 90 minutes, and you call it a day. Episode 1 could have been a fun 60-minute thrill fest. Episode 2 could have been a cool 45-minute murder mystery. And Episode 3, well, we'll get to that. Like, in Episode 1, there's that architecture subplot which goes absolutely nowhere. Episode 2 has its character backstories which are simultaneously both really scant and dragged out. And Episode 3 manages a fun opening 10 minutes before just giving up on any kind of narrative pacing and hangs around till the bitter end, completely out of ideas. Agatha Van Helsing. The review from The Guardian compared Dracula to Sherlock, and it is extremely true, and precisely one of the biggest issues that drags down both shows is a point that H-Bomb made in their video, namely that Moffat subsumes everything in the show to the endless machinations of the Sherlock-Moriarty partnership. Like, with Sherlock, exactly the same happens here. Rather than a group of characters who band together, the whole plot of all 3 episodes is entirely based around the duo of Agatha Van Helsing and Count Dracula. Dolly Wells makes a fun AVH and is by far the most capable character in the whole show, but to be honest, that really isn't saying much. In adaptations of the novel, what you need is a point of view character who can be the audience surrogate, usually Jonathan Harker, but you also need a way of combating and explaining of the nature of the vampire to both the audience and other characters, which is the role of Van Helsing. Making Van Helsing a nun isn't in and of itself a bad idea. After all, one of Van Helsing's earliest conversations in the novel is to tell the earnest Dr. Seward that he has to put aside his contemporary science and medicine and just believe. This isn't necessarily a theological or religious faith either. Van Helsing is maybe best understood as a late 19th century equivalent of Fox Mulder. The issue here is that the show has a charismatic character but no real interest in placing that character into a situation where collective action might get things done. Yes, AVH Agatha is very good at telling people what to do, but there is no crew of light, there is no group action against Dracula, and even if Agatha can deliver the dialogue well, the first episode still ends with Dracula feeding on her. The next episode opens with a fucking chess match between the two in one of the least subtle visual metaphors I've ever seen. The two then bicker and provide yet more expositional dumps for the audience, all leading up to the reveal of the big twist of who is inside cabin number 9. It turns out, of course, to be the incapacitated and half-dead Agatha, who Dracula has been feeding on. Hang on. Inside number 9? Is that a reference to the far better written horror show Inside Number 9, written by friends of Moffat and Gatiss? Well, if they encourage people to watch that, at least something good will come out of this Dracula adaptation. Of course, the whole point of Van Helsing as a character is that it's their leadership of the group which eventually leads to the defeat of Dracula. But here, given that the show kills off Agatha after episode 2, there has to be a way of bringing back Agatha and Dolly Wells for episode 3, which they managed to do thusly. They introduce a descendant of Agatha Van Helsing called Zoe Van Helsing, who, coincidentally, looks identical to them, and who is also, coincidentally, dying of cancer. By drinking Dracula's blood, Zoe Van Helsing takes on the memories of Agatha because those memories were absorbed by Dracula when he fed on Agatha Van Helsing. Then, Agatha takes over Zoe's body and personality through a process of genetic memory, and it's Agatha who figures out how to finally end this whole boring saga. Jack Seward is useless and contributes nothing to the story in the slightest. Literally nothing about the episode in which he appears would be any different without this character. In how this adaptation treats the character of Lucy Westenra, this production stops being just bad and shows a gross streak of paternalistic misogyny. The character of Lucy is complicated at best. In the novel, she is what we call a new woman figure, a fairly common trope at the time. The new woman was sexually agential, not necessarily keen on traditional monogamy and societal gender roles. In the novel, she explicitly says that she wants to be married to more than one person. She's eventually turned into a vampire, and then comes an infamously problematic scene where her 3 suitors, including her fiancé, who just so happens to be the richest one, all go into her tomb and smash a big pointy stake into her body. In this version, Moffat decides to use this complex character to make the point that women do be taking selfies and going to clubs. Precisely because of those behaviours, at least that's all this episode shows us, Lucy is made out to be a hedonistic nihilist who's in love with the idea of death. The way her character is treated in the 3rd and final episode is genuinely horrifying, and there is a clear sense that this is in some way deserved for the heinous offence of partying, which gives the whole arc an air of boomerish moralism that is deeply distasteful. Her suffering is a punishment for her behaviours before her seduction by Dracula. If anything, all Dracula does is encourage pre-existing character traits, and it is those which the show seeks to punish her for. Her transformation into the beautiful undead doesn't mean anything, because as an audience we don't have the time to build any kind of connection with her. For the majority of the episode we encounter Lucy through other people. Jack Seward idolises her, and given that he's the POV character for the audience in episode 3, it means that we only ever see Lucy at a distance, and so her eventual seduction, murder, and undead resurrection doesn't mean all that much beyond the condescension of a middle-aged white guy complaining about kids these days. Episode 3 is a complete mess, and we will get to that ending. By this point, with Agatha dead, with Mina dead, with Jonathan dead, and frankly anyone else who might be halfway interesting dead, the show turns to Renfield, played by Mark Gatiss, to essentially write themselves out of a trap. The trap is an old Stephen Moffat trick, the secret mercenary biotechnology lab. It turned up in Sherlock, it was a pivotal plot point in Jekyll, as well as popping up in multiple Moffat-written Doctor Who episodes, and it turns up here. Dracula is captured to be the subject of some biomedical experimentation, and then he manages to summon a lawyer from a firm he has had on retainer for the last 120 years. Leaving aside how this happens, mostly because it is groan-inducingly bad and depends upon a mysterious mercenary biotech organization not having any understanding of how the internet works, the lawyer comes along and gets Dracula free. The aim is clearly to provide a conversation partner / minion for Klaus Bang as he hangs around his moodily lit London bachelor pad, swiping through potential victims on his phone in a cross between Tinder and Deliveroo. I think this is supposed to be funny, which is kind of strange for a couple of reasons. The first being that if the aim was to give Dracula a conversational sparring partner, that doesn't really work if the relationship is one of client and lawyer. Secondly, this adaptation stages the relationship very quickly, so after breaking Dracula out of his secret hospital base level, pretty much the very next scene, Renfield has taken on the role of the Igor character, the subservient toady who wishes to please their master. The whole point here is that Renfield goes from being a competent agential figure to someone who's completely subservient almost immediately, and with no arc that shows the impact that Dracula can exert. If you want to see an example of this done well, look at Renfield's arc in Herzog's Nosferatu, where we move from a competent agency to subservient madness convincingly, and in a way which shows Dracula's ability to control others. Quincy. Quincy gets mentioned for literally like 5 seconds of screen time, and it's so disappointing. Also, this is supposed to be a character that Lucy falls in love with, and the two of them exchange almost no dialogue, and even the proposal scene is only seen at a distance, and then he never appears again. What a waste of time. Jonathan Harker comes off in the novel and many of the adaptations as well-meaning, but essentially kind of clueless, and in the adaptations which decide to play up the sexual anxieties of the text, he comes off as insecure and threatened by the virile, dominant, and far kinkier Dracula. See the relationship between Mina and Jonathan in the 1992 Coppola version, wherein the chemistry between Mina and the Count is infinitely more believable than her relationship with a rather straight-laced Harker. In this version, John Heffernan could have made a good Harker, but once the episode is more than 10 minutes in, he's got next to nothing to do, and his death at the end of episode 1 seems to be something of a relief. I haven't even had time to mention the completely extraneous characters, like the Lord and Lady Ruthven, who only pop up in episode 2 to demonstrate that Moffat has heard of John Polidori, and to allow for some queerbaiting between Klaus Bang and Ruthven, despite Moffat making it extremely clear that his version of Dracula was in no way bisexual, but was rather bi-homicidal, as Moffat, in an amazing demonstration of his understanding of metaphor, told The Telegraph that he's not actually having sex with anyone, he's drinking their blood. Then there is Dr. Sharma and Adisa, two actually interesting characters who are both denied any depth of backstory and treated as ultimately disposable, which is a real shame, as the small glimpses of character they are given raise some fascinating questions, and probably make them the most compelling characters in that entire episode. Dracula. I wanted to like Klaus Bang. He is an immensely talented actor and has a combination of wolfish charm and violence which makes for a good Dracula. The problem isn't him, but rather the script he's been given. Almost every line is some hammy quip. Of course, he doesn't drink wine. There is no one living in the castle. It starts out fun, but this kind of arch writing gets old very quickly. There are some good moments through episode 1. It is by some distance much better than the other two, and the Count as seducer in episode 2 is enjoyable enough, but as the show goes on, more and more time ends up getting spent on the long conversations between Agatha, or Zoe, and the Count, and increasingly the Count looks more and more bored by the whole ordeal. For most of the third episode, he doesn't do all that much, aside from lounge around his flat, ignore his lawyer, and tries to hook up with and murder people. The problem is that because 1, Lucy has been punished to undeath for the crime of taking selfies, and 2, Agatha has been dispatched, there is literally nothing to do before the end. Which brings us to the ending, or there is no potion again. I mentioned at the beginning that Moffat was behind a TV sequel adaptation of Robert Louis Stevenson's Gothic novella, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. In the Moffat version, it turns out the modern-day Henry Jackman, get it, is a direct descendant of Henry Jekyll, who was a real person and who met Stevenson, who agreed to fictionalize the story of Jekyll, but it's revealed that there is no potion, and it was love that made Jekyll transform. It is not a good show, and this kind of cheap subversion of the source material is both a trick and phenomenally disrespectful to the text you are trying to adapt. The very ending of the novel Dracula is a battle between the Crew of Light and the armed guards hired by Dracula. There's death, there's victory, the monster gets beaten. In this version, Moffat returns to the familiar trick, not only bringing back the idea of genetic memory that he took from Jekyll, but also throwing in a cheap twist that actively undermines all the pre-existing lore about the main character. You see, it turns out sunlight doesn't really affect Dracula. Neither really do crucifixes, but these are simple generational superstitions which have accumulated over centuries, which Dracula has come to believe because these legends allow him to hide himself away from a society that he does not feel worthy of. All Dracula is ashamed and afraid of death, and that is how we choose to end the show. Rather than any kind of triumph over Dracula, we decide instead that what is needed is mercy. Once again, Moffat decides to take the audience's legs out from underneath them, and the adaptation tries to outsmart its own source material. At the very end, all threat has been removed, and the show ends in a murder-suicide mercy killing, with Dracula drinking Zoe Van Helsing's cancerous blood, which is apparently fatal for the vampire. It's a cheap knockoff of the ending of Herzog's Nosferatu that can only leave the watcher feeling drained. In a letter to the Archbishop of Paris written in 1762, Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote that if ever there were in the world a warranted and proven history, it is that of vampires. And this show shows what it might mean if that history were to run out. Dracula has been maybe one of the most compelling figures in film for around 100 years, and as Nina Auerbach writes in their landmark text, Our Vampires Ourselves, vampires go where power is. In contemporary capitalism, where does power reside? Is there still space for exploring the limits of desire, power, death, and violence? When you start asking those questions, you realize this adaptation doesn't really have any answers. It's trying to do something new, but in doing so, can only reveal that its conception of the vampire is deeply nostalgic. By the end, this version of Dracula has moved from being high camp fun to mysterious threat, to something that we are supposed to pity. It's backward looking, and an adaptation that doesn't seem to really like the text it's drawing from, and sees it only as something to go beyond. But in so doing, in the attempt to show just how clever this version is, all that is revealed is a writer who is completely out of ideas. Moffat kills off Dracula, making this iconic horror character into a bored aristocrat who dies because there isn't anything else to do. But if there's anything we know about vampires, it's that they will always return in new and more dangerous forms. If horror reflects the cultural anxieties of a given moment, it functions as something which allows us to explore our collective fears. Watching Stephen Moffat's Dracula is a reminder of just how well the novel managed to do those things. Revisionist Draculas are a necessity. After a century of adaptation, we need to rethink and reimagine what monstrosity is and can be in the late capitalist age. We're living through an age where predation has never been greater. The vampire of capitalism only accelerates how much it feeds on the life and labour of us all. And yet, at this moment, this is the Dracula we got. Horror is an incredible way of processing and understanding the nightmare we live through. And this is what we were given from a writer who doesn't seem to care about the source material, understand what makes it impactful, or have any new ideas to share. And don't even think about bringing this back for a second season.